After their mother died of sickness, 3 little girls cling to their grieving father until one day he drives away. But when he returns, it's to a plea that pierces his soul. "Please don't leave us here." The girls were barefoot when they chased the wagon. He hadn't noticed them slip out. Eliza, the eldest at only 9, was the fastest. She ran with her arms outstretched, dust clinging to her hem and face, her voice shrill with panic as she screamed, "Papa, please, don't go. You said you'd come back." Jacob didn't stop right away. His hands were white-knuckled on the reins, jaw clenched tight, chest heaving like he was choking on air itself. Every foot the wagon rolled away from that creaking little farmhouse felt like a betrayal, even if it was what he thought he had to do. He had told himself the girls would be safer with their Aunt May in Bitter Ridge. He'd even started to believe it, until that voice cracked the dawn. He yanked the reins. The wagon jerked, one wheel catching, a stone nearly toppling the whole load of oats he'd meant to trade in town. The mule brayed and stomped. Behind him, the dust began to settle. Jacob turned on the bench seat and saw all 3 of them, Eliza, holding little Clara's hand, and Ruth just behind them, dragging her doll by one limp, dirty arm. Ruth was only 5, and Clara barely 4. Eliza's chest heaved like she'd run a mile, and then she said it again, so soft this time he had to lean down off the wagon board to hear it. "Mama said you'd come back for us." Jacob closed his eyes. It had only been 3 weeks since Margaret passed. Fever had taken her quick, but not before stealing her voice, her strength, her color, the woman he'd built a life with, gone, overnight, like smoke off the river. He hadn't meant to abandon them, but the way the girls had stared up at her still form, the way they clung to his legs that first night, begging for stories their mother used to tell, something in him cracked. He hadn't cried, not once, not even at the burial. Instead, he'd gone out and chopped wood until his palms bled. Then he'd packed the girls' bags. He'd lied to them. He said it was just for a week. Said Aunt May would spoil them with sugar cakes and fancy combs and new boots. They were excited at first. Eliza even braided Ruth's hair with red ribbon. Clara asked if Mama would be there too. He had to walk out the door before he broke in front of them. But now, watching them cry behind his wagon, Jacob felt lower than dirt. He hadn't even made it a mile down the road. He climbed down slowly. His boots crunched on the gravel. Ruth ran forward first, throwing herself at his legs. Eliza tried to keep her pride, tried to stand tall, but her lip quivered. "You said you'd come back," she whispered. "You said you'd never leave us." Jacob fell to one knee and pulled all 3 of them into his arms. For the first time since Margaret died, he wept. Not loud, not broken, but tears slid from his eyes, down his beard onto Clara's shoulder. She didn't say anything. She just patted his back the way her mother used to. "I'm sorry," he murmured into their hair. "I thought I was doing right. I didn't know how to be enough for you." Eliza pulled back first. "We don't need enough. We just need you." That night, they didn't go to Aunt May's. They didn't go to Bitter Ridge at all. They went home, back to the crooked farmhouse with the broken shutter and Margaret's boots still sitting by the door. Jacob lit a fire and made toast with lard and jam and sang a lullaby he hadn't dared touch since before the fever came. And for a while, that was enough. But storms don't wait for healing. 2 days later, a man rode up the path with a gray hat, and bad news. He was from the county office. Jacob had missed the tax deadline. There were rumors the bank would seize the land. Margaret had handled the books. Jacob hadn't even opened the ledger since she passed. He didn't know how close they were to losing everything. He offered to work for the neighbors. Chop wood, haul fence posts, whatever it took. But by week's end, it wasn't enough. A man named Sherman Banks, slick, red-faced, too clean for honest labor, showed up with papers and a warning. "Eviction's been signed. You got until Friday. said, stepping over Ruth's doll like it was trash. "Unless you got some miracle stashed under that busted floorboard." Jacob kept his fists at his side. He didn't say what he wanted to. That night he found Eliza sitting on the porch, sewing one of Clara's socks with thread too thin for Knieg. "The job?" She was humming something soft, one of her mother's old tunes. "You ain't gonna let him take us, right?" she said, eyes still on the sock. Jacob sat beside her. "Not if I can help it." "I think Mama sent you back," she whispered. "I think she knew you'd come." He swallowed hard. "I don't know how to fix this, Eliza." "You fix fences," she said simply. "Fix us, too." The next morning, he loaded the wagon with tools, not for trade this time, but for work. He went from ranch to ranch, fixing whatever he could, sleeping under the stars with the girls curled beside him like pups. He taught Eliza to sharpen a blade, taught Ruth how to braid rope, taught Clara how to hold a hammer without smashing her fingers. They laughed sometimes. Other times they just held hands and stared into the fire like it might tell them what to do. Then came the storm. It blew through in the night, howling like something alive, peeling the roof from the old wagon barn. One of the horses spooked, broke its leg in the mud. Jacob had to put it down with Ruth watching from behind a tree. They lost more than shingles. The next morning, Sherman came back with a sheriff's man and a wagon. "Last warning," he said. Jacob packed what he could. He wasn't going to beg. But then Clara started coughing. A deep, wet cough, just like Margaret's had sounded that first week. Jacob didn't wait. He rode hard to the nearest doctor, 10 miles over rough trail. He had no money, only a borrowed horse and a promise. The doctor was tired, nearly refused him, until Eliza stepped into the room. She walked straight up to that grizzled old man and said, "Please, sir, she's all we've got left. Don't let her go too." The doctor came. He stayed the night. Clara lived. Barely. But by dawn, her fever broke, and Jacob sat beside her bed, holding her little hand like it was the only thing tethering him to this earth. "Papa," she whispered hoarsely. It was the first time she'd said it, and something in him broke wide open. But it wasn't the end, because when they returned to the farmhouse, it was empty. Their things were gone. The furniture, the blankets, even the tin cup Margaret used to keep her hairpins in. Only one thing remained: Ruth's doll, left face down in the dirt, and a note nailed to the door. "We warned you." Jacob didn't say a word. Not that night, not the next. He just picked up the doll, turned to his daughters and said, "We're going." "To where?" Eliza asked, but he was already walking. They followed, not because they understood, but because they trusted, and because the only thing more dangerous than losing everything was staying where you weren't wanted. Jacob led the girls into the woods that morning with nothing but a blanket, a sack of bread, and the doll clutched tight in Ruth's arms. Clara still looked pale, and Eliza kept checking her forehead with the back of her hand like she'd seen Margaret do. The wagon was gone. Their home was gone. But Jacob's silence was not cruel. It was heavy, like something sacred he was still trying to protect. He didn't speak until they reached the tree line. "We'll build," he said. Eliza looked up, from Clara's side. "Out here?" Jacob nodded. "My father had a trapping shack a mile in. If the frame's still standing, we'll patch it. If not—" He hesitated, then added, "We'll make do." They walked single file under pines that whispered with the wind. Jacob held Clara when she got tired, shifting her weight against his chest even though his back ached from the work of too many days without rest. Ruth kept asking if there'd be squirrels to play with. Eliza didn't speak much at all. They reached the old shack by late afternoon. The roof had collapsed in one corner, and a family of raccoons had made a nest under the floorboards. But the chimney was sound, and the stone base still held steady. And against the wind. Jacob looked at it like a man finding a shipwrecked piece of his past, and didn't waste a second. He set the girls down, handed Eliza a coil of twine, and started gathering wood. "We'll need to sleep in shifts tonight," he said. "Too cold for all of us to lay down at once. We'll take turns tending the fire." Eliza's face, sharp with fatigue, didn't question him. She nodded and took Ruth's hand. Jacob worked until his hands bled. He used bark strips for lashings, moss for chinking, and an old tarp from the tool sack to patch the roof corner. By nightfall, they had a place to sleep. Not warm, not clean, but shelter. He tucked Clara close and let the other two huddle beside the stones while the fire crackled. That night, he dreamed of Margaret. She stood at the end of a hallway that didn't exist, wearing the dress she'd married him in, wind in her hair, though no window was open. "I knew you'd come back to them," she whispered. He reached for her, but woke up to the sound of Ruth coughing. She was cold. Jacob added another log and wrapped his coat around her. He didn't sleep again. The next morning, he gave the girls the last of the bread and went hunting with a slingshot and 3 stones. It took hours to catch one rabbit. He skinned it with a rusted blade and boiled it in a dented pot Eliza had salvaged from the overgrown cellar pit. Clara ate first, then Ruth, then Eliza. Jacob waited until they were full and sipped the broth when they turned away. It went like that for days. He built, he hunted. He taught Eliza how to check traps and Ruth how to gather pine nuts. Clara stayed close, never more than an arm's length away. She didn't say, "Papa," again, but she didn't need to. The way she looked at him said, more than any word could. Then came the knock. They had been in the woods 2 weeks when it happened. One evening, just after Ruth had finished singing a song her mother used to hum. A sharp, firm knock on the old door. Jacob stood first. He reached for the axe leaning against the wall and opened it slow. A woman stood there. Her face was thin, lips pale, hands trembling. "Jacob Morrow?" she asked. He didn't answer. "I'm from the mission," she said. "Someone left word you might be up here." He stepped outside, shutting the door behind him. "What do you want?" The woman didn't shrink. She looked up at him, eyes full of quiet fear. "We heard what Sherman did. Half the town did. And we heard you've been living out here with 3 little girls and no help." Jacob said nothing. She pulled a small parcel from her satchel, wrapped in cloth, tied with string. "Flour, dried apples, some salt, it's not much." He took it from her slowly. "There's a woman at the chapel," she added. "Her name's Cora. She lost her husband last fall. She runs a school now, says she'd help with the girls if you came down." Jacob stared past her into the trees. "I can't ask for help." "You're not asking," the woman said. "She's offering." He didn't reply. Not that night, but he kept the apples. And the next morning, he told Eliza to put on her shoes. They walked to the chapel 2 days later. It was smaller than he remembered, just a white building with a lean bell tower and a crooked sign. But when Cora stepped out to greet them, something strange settled in Jacob's chest. She looked like no one he'd known, but the way she bent to speak to Ruth, to ask Clara if she liked books, to place her hand on Eliza's shoulder without overstepping, he felt something shift. Cora smiled at him. "You don't have to say yes. You can just sit. Let them breathe a while." He sat. For the first time since Margaret's passing, he sat without counting hours or planning meals. Inside, the girls played with paper dolls and chalk slates. Clara laughed once. Jacob forgot how it sounded. Cora brought him tea. "Margaret was your wife," she said, not as a question. He nodded. "I lost Henry last fall. Horse broke its leg on a trail. He went out to put it down. Never came back. Got caught in a wash. I found him 3 days later." Jacob didn't answer. She kept talking anyway. "I didn't eat for a week. Couldn't sleep in our bed. I just kept opening the window and hoping the wind would blow the ache out." He looked at her, really looked, and saw not a woman offering pity, but one who had clawed her way through grief too. "I'm not trying to fix you," she said, "or them. I'm just saying, this place has room for ache, and we don't ask people to be whole before they come through the door." He stood after that, gathered the girls, and thanked her. She didn't ask if he'd come back. But when he returned to the woods, Eliza looked up at him and said, "She's kind." Jacob said, "Yes. She reminds me of Mama." That stopped him. He turned, surprised. Eliza smiled faintly. "Not in how she looks, just in the way she sees us." Clara touched his hand. "Can we go back tomorrow?" He didn't say no, and the next day he did return, not for help. Not for food, but for books and space, and the echo of Margaret's voice in stories told aloud. The days stretched. Cora visited the shack sometimes, helped hang new shingles, brought a chair with a broken leg that Ruth insisted was for the dolls. And, slowly, the ache softened. Not disappeared, but softened. Until one night, after they'd all fallen asleep beside the fire, Clara crawled into his arms, wrapped her arms around his neck, and whispered, "I think Mama was right." Jacob blinked. "About what?" "That you came back." He held her tight, and in the morning he asked Eliza if she wanted to plant carrots near the chimney wall. Life didn't rush back, it just grew, and that's when Sherman came again. But this time, he wasn't alone. There was a man beside him with a county badge and a paper in his hand. Sherman knocked once, loud. Jacob opened the door with Ruth behind his leg and Clara still holding her doll. Eliza was outside, gathering berries. Sherman smiled. "We hear you've been squatting on government land." Jacob didn't move. "This here," the man said, holding out the paper, "says you got 2 days to vacate, or we clear it for you." Jacob looked down at his daughters, then past them, to the life he was building, and finally to the axe leaning. "Just inside the door, I wouldn't," Sherman said as if reading his mind. "You're already on thin ice." Behind them, someone else rode up. It was Cora. She dismounted before the horse stopped, marched straight between the men, and stood beside Jacob. "He's not squatting. I filed homestead papers last week. You'll too. Find his name on them." Sherman turned purple. "What are you playing at, woman?" She handed the county man a folded paper. The badge squinted at it. "She's right," Sherman sputtered. Cora turned to Jacob. "You wanted help without asking. So I asked for you." Jacob looked at her like the earth had tilted. "You can't keep doing this alone," she said. And for once, Jacob didn't try to argue. He just said, "Thank you." But Sherman wasn't done. He spat on the porch and hissed, "You think you've won. This ain't over." Cora raised an eyebrow. "I think it is." He left, but his shadow didn't, because the next day the shack caught fire, and all 4 of them were inside when it started. Smoke. The first warning wasn't the flames. It was the acrid taste in Eliza's throat. She was closest to the chimney wall, arms wrapped tight around Ruth, who had fallen asleep mid-sentence. A faint crackle like a whisper under the floorboards tickled her ears. Then Clara screamed. Jacob was on his feet in seconds, instincts kicking in faster than thought. The door was hot. He grabbed the girls one by one, thrusting them into Eliza's arms as he kicked out the back panel, splintering the thin wood that had only days earlier been patched with hopeful hands. "Run!" he barked, coughing. The smoke chased them like a hungry thing. The fire had started beneath. Someone had soaked the dried moss insulation with kerosene or oil. It was too quick, too intentional. Eliza didn't stop to think. She dragged Ruth and Clara into the trees, barefoot and wide-eyed, leaves cutting into her feet, tears streaking through soot. Jacob came out last, clutching the old doll, singed, but intact. They stood in the clearing and watched everything they had built burn to the ground. Cora arrived minutes later. She had been on her way with a pot of stew and a sewing kit for Eliza's torn sleeve. But the rising column of smoke had pulled her from the path. She dropped the pot in the ferns and ran straight to Jacob. "No one hurt?" He shook his head, but his eyes were empty. The home they'd scraped together, every nail he'd hammered, every trap he'd built, gone in one breath of fire. He didn't speak when Cora reached for his arm. He didn't cry when Clara asked where. The doll's other boot had gone. He just stood there, smoke curling through his beard. That night they stayed with Cora. The girls curled up on a straw mattress in her loft, the one meant for sewing projects and spare books. Eliza wouldn't fall asleep until Jacob lay on the floor beside her. Cora didn't press. She made a bed for herself in the kitchen and sat at the table long after the candles burned down. By morning, Jacob still hadn't spoken, until Ruth sat beside him, cradling the singed doll in her lap. "Can we make her a new boot?" Jacob stared at her small fingers, the soot on her cheeks, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. He knelt beside her. "We'll make her too," he said hoarsely. "So she has a pair." Ruth smiled. It was the smallest light, but enough. Jacob turned to Cora. "What's the cost of lumber in town?" She hesitated. "Too high for most." He nodded. "Then I'll cut my own." "You'll need a cart, a permit to haul from the county grove." "I'll figure it out." Cora's jaw tightened. "Jacob, you need to let me help." He looked at her. "You already have." But when he tried to leave that afternoon, she stopped him with something stronger than hands. Her voice. "You think you're protecting them by doing everything alone," she said quietly. "But you're showing them it's not safe to lean." Jacob stared at her. "They'll grow up thinking love is silent," Cora continued. "That help is weakness. That grief is something to be buried instead of healed." His shoulders sagged. Eliza stood in the doorway, listening. Jacob swallowed. "I don't know how to lean." Cora stepped closer. "Then start small. Let someone bring nails." He didn't answer. But he didn't walk away either. The next morning, the clearing that had once held their shack echoed with new sound. Hammers, saws, voices not his own. Men from the chapel came first. Then 2 women who'd known Margaret, back in school. One brought bread, the other brought bricks. By midday, a foundation was being dug. By nightfall, a framework stood. Jacob watched from the tree line with Eliza, who now wore a ribbon Cora had tied in her hair. Ruth chased Clara, with a piece of chalk drawing pretend animals in the dirt. And Jacob, for the first time in months, let someone else swing the hammer while he held the baby. Because Clara still clung to him like a branch in storm water, and when she curled against his chest that night under the stars, she whispered again. "You came back." He kissed her forehead. "I never left." Then came the letter. Folded, sealed, no return address, left on the chapel steps in a child's handwriting. Eliza found it. She read it out loud, voice trembling. "You took our sisters, but not forever. Papa said he'd get them back. He just needs time. He says you're making them weak with church women and soft beds. He says Mama would be ashamed. We're coming soon." Ruth didn't understand the words. Clara, barely older, only frowned. But Eliza froze. "Sherman," she whispered. Cora took the letter, held it to the lamp, and saw the faint smudge of fingerprints. Grease. Wood stain. He didn't write this himself. Jacob said nothing, but Eliza's hands trembled. "I remember now. He had other kids. 2 boys. Older. They never spoke." Cora nodded grimly. "He's sending them." The threat was clear. It wasn't over. Jacob didn't sleep that night. He walked the perimeter of the clearing with a lantern, checking trees, marking brush paths. The girls didn't know. he made. Sure, they didn't know, but Eliza did. The next morning, Jacob taught her how to shoot. It wasn't a rifle, just a slingshot and small stones, but her hands were steady, her aim sure. You don't have to be brave, he told her, just aware. She looked up. Will he really come? Yes, she swallowed hard. Then we'll be ready. And they were. When the boys came, it wasn't loud, just two shapes in the trees at dusk. Jacob saw the flicker of movement and stepped between them and the cabin. Eliza was inside with the other girls. Cora had gone to town for flour. Stay where? You are, Jacob called. The boys didn't answer, but they didn't run, just two silhouettes, skinny, hollow-eyed, maybe 12 or 13. You don't want this, Jacob said. He sent you, didn't he? Still nothing, until one stepped forward, slow. He said they were ours, the boy said. He said you stole them. I saved them. The second boy spoke. He said to bring them back or don't come back at all. Jacob's chest ached. He looked closer. Their eyes weren't full of fight. They were full of fear. Are you hungry? That stopped them. The boys blinked. Jacob lowered the axe. Come eat, then decide what you want. The boys followed, not because they trusted him, but because starvation was stronger than threats. Inside, Eliza served stew with Cora's apron tied around her waist. Ruth offered a crayon. Clara fell asleep before the meal ended. The older of the two boys, Henry, spoke first. Is it always like this? What? Warm. Jacob nodded. When the stove works. They slept in the loft, and in the morning, Henry left a note by the fire. We won't tell him, but he'll come anyway. Jacob read it twice, then looked at the girls. He built a second door on the cabin that day, reinforced the windows, planted nails upright under the sills. Cora came back at sundown and asked why. Because the fire didn't scare him, Jacob said. And hunger didn't stop the boys. He'll come next. Cora frowned. We can go to the sheriff. He owns the sheriff. She hesitated. Then what do we do? Jacob looked out at the clearing where the girls were catching fireflies. We don't let him take what God gave us back. That night, a storm rolled in. Not rain, not thunder, but Sherman himself. He didn't knock this time. He roared, a shout from the tree line. Jacob stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. I'm here for what's mine, Sherman bellowed. Behind him, 3 men, bigger, meaner, armed. Jacob didn't flinch. You lost that right the day you traded them for whiskey. They're my blood. Blood doesn't make a father. Sherman spat into the dirt. You think you can hide behind prayers and pity? I built those girls. I buried their mother. You just patched a fence and played house. Behind Jacob, Eliza held Ruth close. Cora stood beside the hearth, hand on Clara's back. Jacob stepped off the porch. One step, then another. The rain hadn't started yet, but the wind howled. You can try, Jacob said quietly. But if you take one more step, it'll be the last you ever make. Sherman sneered, then laughed, but he didn't move. And when Henry and the younger boy stepped out from behind the cabin, standing beside Jacob, holding nothing but sticks, and fear, Sherman stopped laughing. You too, he hissed. Henry didn't look away. We're done being afraid. Jacob raised the rifle. Behind him, a bell rang. The chapel bell, over and over, echoing through the trees. Sherman turned. So did his men. Cora smiled from the doorway. Sound travels fast in these parts, she said. And the Lord doesn't sleep. In the distance, more voices, more men. Not armed, but strong. Brothers of the chapel, neighbors, farmers, friends. Jacob didn't need to fire, because Sherman turned and ran, and Jacob didn't follow. He just stood there, watching the fireflies rise behind the trees, while Ruth whispered against his chest. Papa. Jacob didn't move for a long time. Even after Sherman and his men vanished into the trees, swallowed by night and justice still pending, he stood where the earth bore his boot prints, still watching the edge of the woods as if daring the dark. To try again. He didn't feel proud, didn't feel triumphant, he just felt tired. It was the kind of tired that clung to the soul and couldn't be slept off. Behind him, inside the warm light of the cabin, the girls whispered. Cora knelt beside the hearth with a cloth, wiping Clara's face where tears and soot had mixed in, streaks. Eliza sat holding Ruth, who had fallen asleep gripping the hem of Jacob's coat even before he'd come back inside. He finally moved when Cora said softly, "They think you're made of iron. You don't have to be." Jacob turned. His jaw worked, but he couldn't say much. Not yet. "Get some rest," she added. "Please." He nodded, not because he was ready, but because her voice shook a little too, and he didn't want to make her say more. By the time dawn broke, the storm had passed, but its scent, wet wood, scorched air, and damp soil, lingered like an omen. Jacob stepped outside with his axe. He wasn't sure what drove him, habit, dread, or defiance, but he needed the motion. He split log after log until sweat mingled with the drizzle, until blisters cracked on his palm and pain outpaced thought. Cora came to him mid-morning with a biscuit in a cloth. "He's gone," she said. Jacob nodded. The sheriff came to town. Sherman tried to pawn the girls again, to someone in a saloon. Jacob stiffened, but the man who heard it was the preacher's son, and he told his father. The sheriff had no choice this time. Jail. For now, likely more. Jacob exhaled once, deep and slow. "He'll try again," he muttered. "No," Cora replied. "Not after last night. The town saw you. He knows the children are watched now." Jacob dropped the axe. "He shouldn't have gotten this far." Cora touched his arm. "You didn't let them down." He looked at her. "I don't want to. Raise them in fear. You won't." The axe lay between them in the dirt. The sound of the children's laughter drifted from the cabin. Eliza had found a nest of kittens beneath the porch, and Ruth was trying to name them all Papa. Later that week, Jacob walked into town. He needed more than nails this time. He needed paper, legal paper. Cora went with him. At the courthouse, the clerk squinted behind wire spectacles, flipping through forms like flies on a summer pie. "You want to adopt 5 girls?" he asked. 3, Jacob corrected. The man raised a brow. "Not related?" "No." "Why?" Jacob glanced at Eliza, standing near the doorway, clutching a straw doll Cora had made. "Because I love them." The man blinked. "That's not required on the form." "It should be," Jacob replied. It took time. More than he had, signatures, statements, interviews. Cora vouched. The preacher vouched. Eliza, when asked if she felt safe, said only, "Safer than I've ever been." The clerk nodded slowly. "We'll need the birth records. Any family contacts?" "No one worth calling," Jacob said, but the records did show something odd. 3 girls listed under Sherman Tully, yes, but only one had Margaret Tully as mother. The other 2 were registered late. Too late? As if someone hadn't wanted them counted. Jacob stared at the sheet. "What does this mean?" The clerk shrugged. "Sometimes men claim orphans as their own to get rations, or sell them later." Jacob felt sick, but he signed every line. Because it didn't matter whose blood they had, it only mattered they were his now. Back home, Eliza slept easier. Ruth followed Jacob like a duckling. Clara began humming while drawing on the wall with charcoal, something she'd never done before, not even once. And one evening, as the sun dropped behind the hill and Cora sewed by the window, Jacob sat beside her and finally said what had lived unspoken between them for weeks. I can't lose them. Cora didn't look up. Then you won't. And I don't know how to be both father and mother. You don't have to. He frowned. She tied off a stitch, turned to him. You be what they need. That's enough. He watched her. She reached for his hand. We're not alone anymore, Jacob. That night, when Eliza asked about school, Jacob froze. We can't afford it yet, he said. Not the way they do it in town, but Cora said, we'll teach them here. Between us, we know enough. Eliza looked up. Will you teach too, Papa? Jacob had never heard the word from her before. Not like that. Not clear. Not soft. But whole. He nodded, and Eliza smiled wider than she ever had. But even joy can't hold out the world forever. The next letter came in a white envelope with black ink, addressed to Jacob, but written by a woman. Sherman is gone. He won't come back. I made sure of it. But there are others. His debts reached far. He promised things he couldn't pay. Now they're looking for what he owed. I'm sorry. No. Name. Just that. Jacob burned it in the stove, but the words stayed. And a week later, strangers came. 2 men in dark coats with city boots and silver spurs. They weren't locals. They asked at the feed store about Jacob Tully, said they were looking to settle a score. No sheriff with them, just pistols and quiet voices. One of the shop boys ran to warn Cora. By the time the men made it up the hill, Jacob was waiting. He didn't wear a gun. He didn't raise his axe. He simply said, "This is your one chance to leave." The taller man, sharp chin, eyes like steel, smirked. "We're not here for trouble. You'll find it anyway." The second man stepped forward. Sherman owed us. He said if anything happened, we could collect what he left. Sherman's gone, Jacob said, and he left ashes. The men stepped closer, but before they could speak again, the door creaked open. Eliza. She held Ruth's hand, and beside them, Cora. No weapons. No shouting, just presence. And for some reason, that presence shifted the air. The strangers didn't reach for their pistols. They left. Jacob didn't relax until night fell, and even then, only after Eliza asked, "Will they come back?" he said. "If they do, they'll find more than debt waiting." It was cryptic, but she understood, and that night she wrote her own letter to someone unknown. "We are safe now. I have sisters. I have Papa, and a woman who smiles like sun through rain. Please don't take that from us. Please let us be." Jacob found the letter by the window the next morning. He didn't ask who it was for. He just folded it and tucked it into his pocket like a blessing. Spring turned the hills gold. Cora began teaching the girls in the afternoon. Jacob worked with Clara on simple shapes, Eliza on numbers, and Ruth on how to sit still without wriggling. At night, he told them stories, not from books, but from memory, of trees older than storms, of his wife who'd loved wildflowers, of the first bird call before dawn. One evening, Cora walked with him to the creek. They didn't speak for a while. Then she said, "You know, you saved more than just 3 girls." He glanced over. "How so?" "You reminded me how to breathe." Jacob swallowed hard. "I don't want to lose this," he said. "You won't. I mean, I don't want to just borrow it." Cora smiled, then stopped walking. He turned, stepped closer. "Then don't borrow. Keep it." He didn't answer right away, just reached for her hand, and she let him. But back at the cabin, another letter was waiting, this one nailed to the door. Words scratched in haste. Debt unpaid. Blood for blood. You've made enemies now, Tully. And beneath it, a symbol. 3 lines. A circle. A mark from an outlaw gang Jacob had once known in his younger years, the ones Sherman had cheated long before he tried selling his children. Cora read it and closed her eyes. They won't stop. Jacob looked at the girls inside. No, he said, but neither will we. The message didn't leave Jacob's mind for a moment, not even while he helped Ruth wash the mud from her boots or when Clara asked him how to spell porcupine for her charcoal drawing on the wall. Not even when Cora handed him coffee and tried to smile like nothing was coming. It was the mark, the symbol scratched into the wood. He hadn't seen it in more than a decade, but it still carried the same weight. Debt collectors without honor, men who didn't use law or fairness, only threat and fear. Sherman had once bragged about dealing with them, trading in lies and whiskey, trying to impress men he didn't belong among. But debts with that gang didn't vanish when a man died. They were inherited or collected by force. Jacob stood outside just after sundown, axe in hand, hat low. The hills were quiet, too quiet. Even the frogs along the creek held their song. He built a second latch for the door. He moved the girls' beds into one room so they'd sleep closer. And he told Cora softly, "If something happens, you get them to the schoolhouse. Reverend Talbot will help." She didn't argue. That told him everything. The next day, Jacob walked to town. It wasn't for nails this time, or paper, or coffee beans. He went to the blacksmith. "Henry," he said, stepping into the heat and smoke. "I need help." Henry looked up from a horseshoe. "What kind of help?" Jacob laid a pouch on the counter. Inside was a small pile of coins and a gold wedding band. The last thing of Sarah's he hadn't buried or burned. "I need a gun." "Two, if you got 'em." Henry frowned. "What's coming?" "Old ghosts." Henry didn't ask more. He handed over a rifle and a revolver. "No charge." "I owe you for helping my boy after his mare threw him," Henry muttered. Jacob nodded once and left. He trained the girls quietly in what to do if men ever came. Not to hide in the barn. Not to speak or cry out. Eliza was to carry Ruth. Clara would take the little pack of dried meat and flint. Cora would lead them out the root cellar, down the path that led to the back field and the ridge behind the church. "You won't need it," Cora whispered one night. Jacob sat at the edge of the bed, watching the girls sleep. "I hope not." But they came 2 nights later, just past midnight. 6 men on horseback, rifles across their backs, lanterns held low. Jacob spotted them only because Eliza had needed water and he'd been near the window, watching the trees breathe. He didn't wake, the girls yet. He stood quietly, lit a single oil lamp and waited by the front door. A knock came, then another, sharp, impatient. He opened the door just enough. A man stepped forward, face half-shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He had a scar that sliced his cheek in half like a forked path. "You Tully." "I am." "You know why we're here?" "You're 2 weeks too late. Sherman's gone. He owed more than you think." Jacob didn't move. "I'm not him." "Doesn't matter. He gave your name. Said if he ran, they could take it from you." "I didn't make that deal." The man leaned closer. "Then give us something. One of the girls, maybe. That's worth a good sum downriver." Jacob stepped fully into the doorway, rifle now clearly visible in his hand. "You say that again, and I'll plant you so deep your bones'll feed the next 10 winters." The man laughed, but it was hollow. Another voice behind him, thinner, said, "Don't push him. Look at his eyes." Scarface didn't flinch. "Then maybe we take her instead." He pointed, right toward Cora, who now stood behind Jacob, quiet but steady. Jacob didn't speak. He stepped forward, raised the rifle, and fired into the sky. Just once. The echo rolled down the hills like thunder. The men jolted. One's hoarse, bucked. Another cursed. "You've got 5 seconds," Jacob said, "and I ain't counting slow." They hesitated, but then one fired back. Not into the sky. Into the cabin. The bullet slammed through the window, cracked glass and Cora's shoulder. She dropped with a cry. Eliza screamed. Jacob fired again, this time not in the air. The man who shot stumbled from his horse, shoulder ripped open. Chaos. Jacob didn't retreat. He stepped off the porch, firing once more, shouting for Cora to crawl back inside. He didn't see who hit him. One of the men caught him from the side, tackled him to the ground, fists flying. The rifle slipped from Jacob's hands. Another man rushed toward the cabin, but Clara had lit the old bear snare by the fence. The man yelped, caught in it, dropping his pistol. Inside, Eliza dragged Ruth and Clara toward the root cellar. Cora pressed, a cloth to her shoulder, trying to stand. Jacob fought on the ground, knuckles split, dirt in his teeth, blood in his mouth. But the men weren't prepared for a fight. They'd expected a handoff. A coward. A man like Sherman. Instead, they found fire. And then the bell rang. The one Jacob had tied to the barn roof weeks ago. The one Eliza pulled with all her might. And down in town, someone heard. Soon lanterns moved in the dark. Men rode up. Jacob lay, half conscious when the riders arrived, Henry, the blacksmith, and two of the preacher's boys, armed and angry. The gang scattered, fleeing through the trees, but they left two behind. One caught in the trap. The other, the man with the scar, too slow to outrun Jacob's last punch. They were tied, dragged into town, and dumped at the sheriff's porch like rotting hogs. Jacob spent the night beside Cora, cleaning her wound. Eliza sat nearby, not sleeping, just watching the door. Clara, despite everything, had managed to carry Ruth to safety. They didn't say much, but when the sun rose, Cora reached out and touched Jacob's hand. "You're bleeding," she whispered. He looked down, didn't even know from where. "I'm okay," he said. "You're not," she replied. "But you will be." He leaned his forehead to hers. "Not without you." "I'm not going anywhere. The sheriff came that morning. The preacher, too. Papers were signed. Threats were recorded, charges filed, and that week the town did something. Jacob didn't expect. They held a gathering. Not a trial, not a burial, a gathering. They brought pies, bread, bolts of cloth. Henry's wife brought shoes she'd made for Eliza. The preacher handed Jacob a deed, one that formalized the girls. Custody. Not just temporary guardianship. Full, legal adoption. "No one will take them from you again," he said. Jacob nearly dropped it. The girls stayed near the house for weeks, still cautious. But one afternoon, Ruth picked a dandelion and walked to Jacob with her tiny fist outstretched. "For you, Papa," she said. He took it with shaking hands. It was the second time she'd used the word, and it felt like sunlight in winter. Weeks passed. Cora healed, though her arm ached in the cold. Clara began writing in a little book Henry's wife had gifted her. Eliza asked to learn how to cook, not because she liked it, but because Mama used to burn biscuits and I want to be better than her. It made them laugh. Even Ruth started, speaking more, mostly to the kittens that still lived under the porch. One evening, Jacob found a box outside the cabin. No note, just wood, rough cut, with something inside. He opened it, Sherman's pocket knife. A rusted key. And a piece of cloth, child's ribbon. Jacob stared at it for a long time, then buried the box. Cora came to him after. "Was it from one of them?" she asked. "I think it was from someone else." "Who?" He shook his head. "Someone who knew Sherman. Maybe someone who wanted to remind me that even gone men cast shadows." She rested her hand on his shoulder. "But light always comes. Back." He nodded. The fire that night burned low, but the warmth lingered. Inside, the girls slept in a tangle. Clara's foot over Ruth's belly, Eliza holding her straw doll by one arm. Cora leaned against Jacob as they watched the flames. "They chose you," she whispered. I didn't give them much choice. No, she said. They chose you because you stayed. Jacob didn't answer, but in his chest, something settled, like peace, like home. And he knew no gang, no ghost, no fear would ever unmake what they'd built now. Not ever. The summer after the attack passed quietly, but not without its own storms. Ruth caught a fever in July. Not the mild kind children bounce back from in 2 days, but the sort that makes a grown man sit beside a cot through the night, listening for each rattling breath and praying beneath. His breath, like his heart, depends on it. Jacob didn't sleep for 3 nights straight. Cora did everything she could. Cool cloths, the willow bark tea the preacher's wife had taught her, even a poultice from a root she'd sworn never to touch. Again. She'd once lost a child, long before she met Sherman, had watched her go still before she could even walk. She told Jacob this in the dark while Ruth trembled under a wool blanket soaked through with sweat. I can't lose another, she said, simply, her voice cracking. Jacob looked at the girl's tiny hands, curled like she was still trying to hold something. She'll make it, he murmured. She's not done yet. He believed it, not because there was proof, but because he needed to, and she did make it. On the 5th day, Ruth opened her eyes and whispered, "Thirsty." It was the most beautiful word Jacob had ever heard. Eliza and Clara wept on the floor beside the cot. Cora slumped into Jacob's arms, exhausted, murmuring thanks over and over. That night, Jacob built a small bench near the porch and carved the initials RM into its side. She sat on it once, he said, after chasing a chicken around the yard. She hates chickens, Cora said sleepily, resting against him. Then she's a smart girl. August brought new tension, not the kind with gunmen or ghosts, but the slow kind that creeps in after danger fades. Jacob found himself stiffening every time a horse rode by. Cora started locking the door even in the daylight. Eliza flinched at thunder. Clara wouldn't sleep without all 3 of her siblings nearby, even if it meant cramping herself onto the floor. The town tried its best to help. The preacher came by often, usually with jam or paper. Henry's wife taught Cora how to dye fabric using boiled walnuts. One of the school teachers offered to tutor Clara twice a week. Eliza turned that down, but Clara eagerly accepted. Jacob wasn't sure how to tell them that kindness made him feel more helpless sometimes than danger ever had. He tried to repay it. He cut wood for every widow within 5 miles, mended fence, posts, helped raise a new barn. He didn't want to be paid. He just wanted to move, to keep his hands from shaking when he wasn't doing anything. One night, Eliza found him at the shed, resharpening the same axe he'd already honed earlier. That day, "Papa," she said, quiet. He looked up. The word still rang like a bell inside him each time she said it. "You ain't slept. I'm fine. You look like Mama used to after she stayed up with Ruth." Jacob lowered the axe. Eliza stepped inside the shed and sat on the dirt floor, folding her legs like a grown-up. "She told us a story once," she said, "about a bird that carried fire." He raised an eyebrow. "She said this bird, he was gray and sad, and no one liked him, but he found a spark one day, glowing under a stone, and instead of keeping it, he carried it from house to house, flying in the rain, giving it to others. So they wouldn't freeze." Jacob sat down beside her. She said that bird was real, and when he gave away his last spark, his feathers lit up like gold, and he flew so high no one ever saw him again. That's a good story. "She said you were like that bird." Jacob's throat tightened. "Did she now?" "She did." He put his arm around her shoulders just for a moment. "You're carrying the fire too, Eliza." She shrugged. "You carried it first." He couldn't speak for a while after that. September brought new rhythms. Clara began reciting poems she made up. Some were terrible, delightfully so. Ruth got strong enough to run again, and promptly. fell into the creek on purpose. Eliza started reading books beyond her age, devouring them like bread. Cora took to keeping a journal, one she never let anyone see. One afternoon, Jacob found her crying behind the barn. She didn't hear him coming. "Cora," he said gently. She wiped her eyes. "Stupid of me." "What is?" She held out a scrap of paper, a drawing, not a child's but hers, of a girl with long braids and a missing shoe. "My sister," she said. "She died when we were little. I always meant to draw her. I never could before now." He didn't say anything, just folded the drawing and placed it in the pocket of his shirt. "She can stay with me now," he said. Cora buried her face in his chest. They stayed like that until the sun slid low. That night, Ruth asked him if ghosts were real. "Why do you ask?" he said. "'Cause I think I heard Mama in the trees." Jacob paused. "What did she say?" "Nothing. Just laughed." He didn't ask more. But later, under a sky full of stars, he walked into the trees alone and whispered thanks, just in case. October brought an unexpected letter, not one with threats or warnings. This was from a lawyer, sent by way of a circuit judge. Sherman's land, it seemed, hadn't belonged fully to him. Part of it was still in Cora's name from before they'd married, and because she was legally considered his widow, even after what he'd done. The land passed to her. It was a sprawling piece of wilderness 2 valleys over. Rocky, wild, unfenced. What would we do with it? She asked Jacob. He didn't know, but the thought of building something from scratch, not repairing what someone else had broken, felt right. Eliza suggested they grow sunflowers. Clara wanted a garden and a big tree to sit under and write. Ruth asked for a well with a rope so she could drop rocks into it. Cora only asked for quiet. Jacob thought about all of it and started drawing plans. It was the first time in a long time he thought about the future without fear in his chest. As winter edged in, so did the cold, but this time the house was ready. The windows sealed tight. The woodpile stacked high. Cora stitched curtains from an old quilt. Ruth fell asleep curled in a blanket that still smelled faintly of lavender. Eliza stood taller by the week. Clara's handwriting grew neater. Even Jacob, who had once let whole months pass without speaking more than a few words, now found himself telling stories at the dinner table, about trees that walked, birds that sang Bible verses, or Sarah's terrible cooking. They laughed together. Really laughed, and when it snowed, thick and soft, the girls ran out barefoot to catch flakes on their tongues until Cora dragged them back inside, scolding and smiling. On Christmas morning, Jacob carved each girl a small toy from pine, a doll for Ruth, a feathered quill for Clara, and for Eliza, a tiny bird, wings stretched wide. He placed it in her hand without a word. She looked at it for a long time, then hugged him around the waist and whispered, "I knew you were the bird." He smiled. "No," he said. "You are." And as the fire crackled, the snow piled on the roof, and the kettle whistled faintly, Jacob knew the old ache would always linger. But it had softened, not disappeared, but it no longer owned him. He had chosen to stay, to carry the fire. And now, he wasn't carrying it alone. The land Sherman had left behind was untamed. Broken rock, patches of wind-worn pine, a stream that sometimes ran dry by mid-July. But it didn't matter. Cora didn't want perfect. She wanted untouched, her own. And Jacob knew, from the way her voice changed when she spoke of it, that it wasn't just land. It was a chance. A second beginning for them all. Spring came late. That year, snow reluctant to release its grip on the valley. But when it finally thawed, Jacob took the girls to see it. He hitched the wagon, loaded with blankets, nails, tools, dried fruit, and Clara's carefully folded drawings of the house. Of the future, she'd been sketching for weeks. They bumped along the trail for nearly half a day, Cora and the girls tucked beside him, passing pine groves and boulders covered in lichen, until the trees opened to a wide plateau soaked in sunlight. Eliza stepped out first. Her boots sank slightly, into the earth. "It smells like new," she said. Clara spun once, arms flung out. "It's big enough for stories." Ruth pointed to a patch of ground and asked if she could dig a hole to China. Jacob laughed. Cora didn't. She was crying. "I didn't know it would feel like this," she whispered. "Like coming home." He nodded slowly. "So did you." And as they walked inside, past the laughter of children not yet asleep, past the crackling hearth and the half-finished quilt on the couch, Jacob knew that no matter how many winters came, no matter what sorrow still lingered in the corners of memory, this was a beginning, built not from what was taken, but from what was given. From what they had chosen from the ones who stayed.